Good morning, ladies. I hope you're doing well today. Today we are looking at a passage in James chapter 5, verses 7 through 11 that have a very strong message for us following last week's message. It's very much showing a perspective that we didn't talk about last week. So before we actually get into the passage, I want to just ask a question for your own consideration and to just kind of stimulate your thinking. What things, situations, people, whatever, what tests your patience? Is it objects? Is it circumstances or people? What tests your patience the most? It could be any of those. It could be all of those. But there are opportunities every day for us to have our patience messed with. We live in the reality of a modern culture that the culture itself makes patience very challenging. The most obvious thing is that the world is just so geared to instant gratification. The things that are at our fingertips instantly, the food that we can order and have delivered to us in minutes, and on and on and on. I mean, travel, we can get from one place to the next so much quicker than it was in the past. So there's a lot of reasons that we have expectations that we really don't need patience, because everything can and should happen for us in a very short order. But that isn't the way it actually works out, is it? And so what is it, if you were to stop and think about it, what are those things, those people, those circumstances that cause you to have a really short fuse? Now, today we're going to look at a situation, at the situation that we looked at last week, and to see how that is related to patience or impatience, and what James has to say about it. So let's read the passage, and then I'll back up and explain last week's passage and how it relates to this one. So today we're looking at James 5, 7 through 11. Be patient, then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. You too, be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Don't grumble against one another, brothers and sisters, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. Brothers and sisters, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. You've heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. Alrighty, so James starts off with the words, be patient. But I want you to notice a couple of things here. He is addressing the brothers and sisters, the Christians that are he is writing to in the early Christian church. Remember, last week, James did not address the Christians. James addressed those super wealthy landowners who were persecuting the brothers and sisters in Christ. And they were excessively lavish in their lifestyle. And James was really upset about their extravagant lifestyles that were so luxurious at the expense of the workers, the Christians that they had hired to work their fields. And so he's saying you're defrauding them of their salary, their legitimate paycheck at the end of the day. You're defrauding them of that so that you can live a lifestyle of indulgence, of really gross indulgence. And we talked about that last week. And so with that in mind, it implies that people had died because of not getting the paycheck. They're not getting enough money to feed their family. And people had died because of it. And James actually says they've been murdered by you wealthy people. And so here we see the contrast between the wealthy and the poor. But now James has set it up for us to see his response to the Christians. How should the Christians respond in light of that incredible injustice? And he starts by saying, be patient. And I'm thinking, seriously? Most of us would be outraged. We wouldn't be patient. We would be outraged by it, and we would want justice. We would want to do something about it. And James says, no, I want you to be patient, brothers and sisters, because the Lord is coming back. Jesus is coming back. So that is a very, very shocking, really, response from James after he had expressed so much emotion and so much energy in last week's passage about the situation and the people involved in the situation. It was just a very sharp commentary on how incredibly harsh the treatment had been of these people. And so now he's saying, I want you to be patient. So he's not saying give up, simply give up. The situation is hopeless because these guys have all the power. No, he would see getting revenge or giving up as an indication that the sin of materialism has really infected the Christians too, but just from a different angle. But instead, he is saying, be patient. Now, patience is a Greek word that I can't pronounce, macrothymio, maybe something like that. But it carries the idea of being patient, but specifically the picture of waiting with patience, waiting with a specific goal or object in view. He uses the example of a farmer who waits for rains to come so that the fruits and vegetables and grains are produced. The farmer is patiently and expectantly waiting for both parts of the process, knowing that rain is necessary in order to get the goal of food for his family. So James refers to these crops as valuable, and he's also speaking of a farmer, not a wealthy landowner. He's making a distinction between these Christians and the arrogant landowners of the previous paragraph, with the point being that there's something much more valuable in life than material possessions. James stated it very clearly early in the letter in chapter 1 and has repeated it often, but let's make sure we know what James considers of most value. Look at James 1, verses 2 through 4. Consider it joy, my brethren, when you encounter trials of various kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Perseverance must finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. So James is saying that in the same way that the farmer must be patient as he works the soil while waiting for rains that will eventually produce crops, he is exhibiting what will bring them the most joy, and they will develop perseverance. All of that plowing hard dirt and working the soil so you can plant seeds, then pull weeds, would really be a complete waste of time if there wasn't a rainfall that was coming. Rain is a common Old Testament symbol of God's promised faithfulness. You can find that in Jeremiah 5, in Joel 2, and in Deuteronomy 11, how rain is portrayed as a blessing from God and his faithfulness. So these Christians would understand James' analogy and see that the rain is the hope of a harvest. So he can patiently work the soil, waiting for the rain. In the same way, God's promised Christ's return, so we can patiently work through our trials. I want you to see, though, that the farmer makes a choice of his values. He must choose the goal of a bountiful harvest as being something worth working for and waiting for. He must choose the goal of maturity and completion. We must choose the goal of maturity and completion and having the righteous life that God desires as being something worth working for and waiting for in light of the upcoming return of Jesus. I want you to notice in 7 and 8, verses 7 and 8, how James uses an imperative. Be patient. You are being patient. Be patient. He says, strengthen your hearts. Stand firm. And this brings the idea of active, strong waiting, not passively sitting around hoping Jesus will return so we don't have to deal with any more struggles here. Instead, Jesus wants us to actively tell anybody that'll stand still and listen long enough about the gift of salvation. But also, he's saying, actively refuse to have a bad attitude about your situation. Actively choose to not complain and grumble at each other, and to actively choose to wait on the Lord. The end of verse 8 uses the perfect tense of the Greek verb engiken, which means approaches or comes near, and it gives a very dramatic emphasis. Some translators actually use the word next to emphasize that the return of Jesus is the very next thing on God's calendar. So that perspective is what James is telling us that you and I need to have when we are facing trials and tribulations. And as we all do, there's nothing new about that statement. There is evidence in each one of our lives that we've gone through, or maybe are in right now, a very serious trial, a very hard span of days or weeks or months that we are enduring in order to produce the kind of, or test the kind of patience that we have that produces that perseverance that James tells us is so important. And as we wait, we're waiting for the return of the Lord, which will alleviate all of our problems. But he wants us to determine in our hearts to stand firm in our faith with patience. The thing that he's saying about not grumbling, it carries the idea, of complaining, where we blame others for our problems. And, I don't want to accuse us, anybody in our group that's listening, I don't want to accuse us of being the grumblers. I'm sure we're not grumbling, but, that's a possibility. That's one of the things that could be happening. But the reason James gives us for not doing this is that God is going to judge us. He's standing at the door waiting to come, standing at the door. There's a passage in 2 Corinthians 5:10 that tells us we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ so that each one may be recompensed for his deeds in the body according to what he has done, whether good or bad. So there's lots of support for this idea of Christians being judged. The judgment for our sins has already been paid by Jesus on the cross. But the Bible teaches us, as Paul says in 2 Corinthians, that there will come a time when we will stand in front of the judgment seat of Christ, in a time in the future where we will be recompensed. That, in other words, for those of us who have done the kinds of things that God asks us to do, we've loved well, we have produced fruit in our lives and around us, that there will be a recompense or a reward for that. Those rewards have been variously described in Scripture, but the most common thing is a crown. And of course, you've probably all heard the thought that we place that crown at the feet of Jesus, because what do we need with a crown? But anyway, the idea is that the judge is there, and the other idea is that the judge is right at the door. We have Revelation 3:20, where he says, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock." So he is standing close by. So to see this is something that is imminent, and that we should not be lazy. We should not take for granted the fact that when James wrote this 2,000 years ago, he was speaking of something that was an imminent arrival, and yet we look back and we see that Jesus did not return 2,000 years ago. And so we get lazy, and we just we flippantly think about the return of Christ like, oh my goodness, I can't remember where it is, maybe in 2 Peter, but it says, where is the return that you have all talked about? And it's a kind of a sarcastic question. You know, you've been waiting all this time. Where is he? Well, he's still coming back. We can depend on that. Actually, he says, it's more than once, he says that the return of the Lord is imminent, when he says, he says it first in the end of verse 8, because the Lord's coming is near. And then in verse 9, at the end, he says the judge is standing at the door. So we know that is coming. And so what are some of the serious challenges to your patience? You know, how have you gone through a trial in the last several years? Has it been a test for your marriage? Has it been a test with your children? Has it been health issues? Has it been financial issues? There's so many things that test our patience, and how are we responding to that? The goal that is being talked about here is to have a focus, a very clear focus on the goal of being mature and complete in light of the coming of the Lord. We tend to lose focus on that goal. We tend to lose our patience and our focus on the return of the Lord. And as a result, we tend to criticize and blame the people right closest to us. And if James was our pastor, he would also remind us to get our focus back to where it is, because the judge is on the way. He might also remind us that part of our problem is that we're being impatient with God. And ladies, I got to tell you, that's a waste of time to try to get God to hurry up, because God is going to answer our prayers for relief from whatever is causing our pain and our suffering. It's on His timetable. It is on His timetable. He's not going to speed up that, because remember the preciousness of a mature and complete child of God is what God is after. That's what he's wanting to accomplish in our lives, that we would be able to persevere. Those who persevere to the end in their faith in Christ are the ones who will be saved. So there's examples in verses 10 and 11 that James gives us or models to follow. First it's the prophets, and then it's Job. I would like to suggest, and I think you'll see it as we look at the book of Job, that maybe Job should be considered as a prophet because of some of his words. So what we're looking for in these verses that James is drawing us to focus on is that the suffering is something that God brings, or else it's just part of living in the sinful world, and that perseverance should be the believer's response to suffering, and that blessing is something that God, who is full of compassion and mercy, will bring. He will bring blessings. So this is what the entire book of James comes down to. Do we go through our lives like we really believe what we say we really believe? The reasons James says we are to be patient in suffering and to consider trials pure joy is because of the fact that God will give wonderfully good gifts even through the hardships. So let's look at Job. Probably the world's greatest example of suffering and not giving up and then getting the gold ring when it's done. That would be Job. I don't want to minimize your suffering by comparing it to what Job went through, but let's just be honest. Who has been put through the ringer to the extent Job went through it? I don't think there's anybody. So let's turn to Job 1, because we need to know a couple of things about this remarkable man. Now, this is not an exhaustive study of the book, just hitting some high points. First, we want to notice that Job was very rich. I love this fact about him because last week the rich people were absolute creeps, and there was nothing about them that was considered to be good. But in this case, God's making sure that we know the distinction between those wealthy and this wealthy man. It's the distinction of where's the person's heart. Is their heart towards God? It's more about the heart and not the size of their portfolio. All right, so let's read about Job here. In Job 1 through 3, we see that there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright. He feared God and turned away from evil. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He possessed 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 female donkeys, and very many servants, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. So we see that he was a wealthy man. That's important. Secondly, we want to see how God describes Job in this next section of the passage. I'm going to read 6 through 8. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, "From where have you come?" Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it." And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil?" Look at that description of Job. In verse 8, let me read it one more time in verse 8. "Have you considered my servant Job? There is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil." I doubt that God is saying, or that the writer of the book of Job would say that Job was sinless and perfect, but from God's perspective, he was darn near close. And do you see in verse 8 that God is really boasting about Job? Let that sink in for a minute. I mean, it's almost a sacrilege in my mind that God would boast in a human. He's the one who gets all the glory, right? But in this, we see that God was incredibly confident in Job's faith. And that even if he goes through hardships, he will come out on the other side of it with his faith intact. So God can brag a little bit about Job. He knows how it's going to turn out because God isn't going to let anything happen to Job that he doesn't know with complete assurance that Job can't handle. And God knows the genuineness of your faith. Really, when you think about it, God wasn't paying Job a compliment. God was paying Job a compliment. Have you considered my servant Vicky? Am I ready to say that to Satan? Yeah, probably not. But God does see each one of us, and the hardship that he has brought or allowed into your life. He has not done that flippantly. He has done that knowing that you and the faith that you have in him will not fail you. So sometimes, we could go a whole another tangent about where do our hardships come from. Sometimes they come from God. Sometimes they come from living in the sinful world. Sometimes I don't think they can come from Satan, because if you'll remember, Satan had to ask God for permission to sift Peter right before the crucifixion. And boy, sift he did. And so that was something, though, that still Satan had to ask permission. It was something from a messenger from Satan, but it was something that Satan had to get permission to do that to Peter. And so I want you to see that as we look ahead in the book of Job, we're skipping over a lot. I just want you to see that when Job finally had endured to the point of giving up, God calls him into a come to Jesus meeting. It begins in chapter 38 and goes through 41. These are powerful, difficult chapters to read, because we picture ourselves being called into a come to Jesus meeting by God, and we see that God is using so much incredible force and revealing to Job that Job, all of your pushback, all of your comments about God in the middle chapters, let me just tell you a thing or two about who I am and who you are not. You are not God. I am God. And so in those chapters 32 to 41, there is a very, very strong confrontation that God brings into Job's life. And at the end of it, we get to chapter 42, and there is such an acknowledgement by Job that he had acted quite impetuously in his statements against God through that entire trial that he went through. So what we see in chapter 42 in the first few verses there is just very beautiful, where Job answers back to God and he says, I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? You said, therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Here I will speak, I will question you, you will make it known to me. But in reality, I had heard of you by the hearing of your ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. You know, I like verse 5 where he says, I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. You know, as mature as Job was before all this started, and God called him there's no one like him. His faith in me is so strong. Yet Job realizes that before all this started, his knowledge of God was probably more a head knowledge and not a heart knowledge. He says, I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear. I knew a lot. I knew who you were, but it was more an intellectual knowing. But now my eye sees you. Isn't that incredible? Now my eye sees you. And I want you to see that James said something so similar when he spoke of Job in his letter. He says, as he mentions Job, he says, as you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance. You've heard about him. And now you've seen what the Lord finally brought about. Isn't that interesting that James would write a similar thing to these believers to point out that just because we've heard of Job before, and we've maybe even read the book of Job, have we been through a trial that has finally caused us to understand, to have the understanding that Job had when all was said and done, but through what the Lord finally brought about in our own lives. So that I think is just an interesting observation from that. Isaiah 61 verse 7, I'm coming back to Job, but I want to just read this to you. When we see what God did, let me just read to you first what God did for Job when all was said and done. He doubled everything. He doubled the number of children. He gave him, instead of 5 children, he gave him 10 children. Instead of, all of his wealth, he gave him, instead of the 7,000 sheep, he gave him 14,000 sheep. Instead of 3,000 camels, he gave him 6,000 camels. Instead of 500 yoke of oxen, he gave him 1,000. Instead of 500 donkeys, he gave him 1,000. And many servants. He was just, it was amazing that he gave him such a double portion of blessing. And so back to Isaiah 61 verse 7, I want you to see what it says. Instead of your shame, you will inherit a double portion. And instead of disgrace, you will rejoice in your inheritance. And so you will inherit a double portion in your land, and everything and everlasting joy will be yours. Isn't that remarkable? That is a promise for us that when we go through something and come out as gold on the other side, the gold value there will be probably more than a double portion, because what we're going to see is our inheritance, our double portion. It may not be on this earth, but oh my goodness, the eternal value of the worth of our faith once we make it to heaven and receive the full glory of our inheritance, it will be staggering. A couple final points here. In Job 19, Job, while he was in the midst of his suffering, he said, "I wish that my words were written down and recorded on a scroll." In 24, he says, "I wish I could engrave it in stone or with iron." And so the idea is, in his suffering, he's wishing that it could be recorded, that someone would take notice, and that it would benefit, his suffering would benefit someone else. Well, he goes on in Job 19:25 and 27 and writes what he was wanting people to know. "I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. I myself will see him with my own eyes, I and not another. How my heart yearns within me." I guess you see now why I said I think Job might be prophetic, because this is a prophetic statement. He does not have, in the midst of his trials, he hasn't experienced this yet, but he is going to. And so he is prophesying that in the end he will stand firmly on the earth. Well, he did. "And after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. I myself will see him with my own eyes, I and not another. How my heart yearns within me." That is true for all of us, that someday we will stand before God and we'll see him with our own eyes. We will see Jesus, not some other kind of being. We will see Jesus. Our heart yearns within us to see Jesus in that perfect, glorified state. So what makes Job the hero? Well, he said this before God restored and blessed him. In his suffering, he looked expectantly and with hope to God. And I hope that is your experience also. I hope that as you have gone through suffering, and maybe you're in suffering right now, that you can take hold of something hopeful here in what Job is saying to us and what James is saying to us, that we must persevere with patience, because the time is coming really soon when God is going to rend the heavens and return. And Jesus is going to take his stand, and he is going to bring justice for our suffering. He is going to bring healing for our suffering, and he is going to bring a double portion to us for our suffering. I hope that that is your perspective. I hope that you are suffering patiently but actively, and that your heart is steadfast in the Lord. Thanks for listening, ladies.